Hello there everybody, welcome back to another Game of the Week coming at you from Jacksonville and the Chess for Charity Chess Club. Today we're taking a look at a battle between Dominick Dillon and Kalen. And the reason I've selected this game this week is this game, though not perfect, it's an absolute slugfest. It's a real entertaining one to see, and we're going to really see the fighting spirit of both of these competitors come out in this game. So as we go through, keep in mind the ebb and flow of it. We're going to see a lot of back and forth, a lot of things that are imperfect. We're not going to spend time analyzing every single move because there's a lot of moves in this game, but we want to make sure to bring you the highlights and get to see some of the action of what is happening in the classical chess right now. That's with Jacksonville Chess for Charity on Monday night. So if you're looking for some longer time control, make sure to come on out, get out on Mondays, and test your skills. Maybe you may also turn in one of the next Game of the Weeks. So this game starts off with a Nimzo Indian, and without going too much into the theory here, we see d4, knight f6, c4, e6, standard openings in the Nimzo, white's taking space in the center. Black is a little bit slower to strike back, but is going to use their pieces in order to strike back at the center over the next few moves. So knight c3, bishop to b4, pinning that knight. And after a3, rather than retreating the main line here, bishop takes c3 and b takes c3. So white is going to get the two bishops, the bishop pair, but in exchange, black has a more solid pawn structure and the ability to strike back at the center with moves like d5. So black castles, knight f3, b6, bishop to g5, and now black plays the move h6, putting the question to white's g5 bishop. Up until now, this has been a pretty standard Nimzo Indian type of position, one that's been played many times before, but here is where the first sort of deviation comes in the game from standard theory. Most often, white is going to choose between one of two things, either bishop to h4, in which case white maintains the pin on the black knight, and black has to decide whether or not it's worth it to push g5 and break this pin, or white often chooses to play the move bishop takes f6, where after queen takes f6, white is not wasting any time in retreating the bishop and can continue with natural development via move like e3 or g3 and preparing to bring the light squared bishop into the game. However, in the game, Dom chose a different path. He chose to keep the bishop on another square with bishop to f4. And again, this isn't an inherently bad move, but it's a little bit inaccurate. It's a little imprecise, because if we are going to retreat the bishop, we should probably bring it to h4, where it's more active, keeping the pin on the f6 knight. So, black continues normally with bishop to b7, white responds e3 and now d5. Very standard Nimzo type idea, striking back in the center using the knight and the bishop, and you can start to see how black really cares about controlling these light squares in the center of the board. The bishop, the pawn, and the knight all working together to control d5 and e4, and those are places that black would love to make an outpost for his pieces. White continues with bishop to d3, knight b to d7, and castles. So we're getting toward the end of the opening here, starting to flow our way into the middle game. The game still has some imbalance to it. Again, white's got the doubled pawns, a slightly worse structure, but the bishop pair as well. Now, black plays d takes c4. This is always a good idea after your opponent has already played a move like bishop e2 or bishop d3, because now it takes white another move in order to recapture that pawn, so sometimes it comes with that loss of tempo. So after bishop takes c4, now black plays the move knight to d5. And once again, just like with h6 earlier, black is asking a question. What does white want to do about this bishop? Of course, we can let black take it. It's not going to be a loss of material, but if black takes this f4 bishop, we're going to give up that bishop pair, which maybe is what we have any sort of advantage in the position. However, there's another problem right now. Well, black is attacking our c3 pawn. So in this way, white really has three options. We can either take the knight in order to keep the tempo, but we would give up our light squared bishop and no longer have the bishop pair. We can retreat the bishop, but that will give up our c3 pawn, although we keep the bishop pair. Or we can defend the c3 pawn with a move like queen to d2 and opt to give up the dark squared bishop on f4, again losing the bishop pair. Now, as much as we like having the two bishops in this position, I think we have to choose to give one of them up, and the best move is probably to play bishop takes d5, and then to continue with development. It's still going to be a very dynamic battle, especially with the opposite colored bishops cutting across very different diagonals in this board. However, in the game, Dom opted for the move bishop to g3, and I don't particularly like this move. Obviously, we're losing a pawn after knight takes c3, but the problem here is white doesn't have a quick way to gain advantage of this. Sometimes a pawn sacrifice is a great thing that we can utilize in order to gain an initiative, but here white really doesn't have any inertia. There's no momentum flowing for the white pieces here. The bishop eyes c7, but it's not so easy to bring another piece to attack the weakness in black's camp. This bishop, of course, is eyeing the knight on f3, could potentially trade at any moment. So Dom continues with queen to d3, and now the problem once again is we can't really take advantage of the c7 weakness, and these squares that we mentioned earlier are still under the control of white's camps, or black's camp rather. So after we see the move knight to e4, black not only brings the knight back to safety, but also threatens to take the g3 bishop and win the bishop pair anyway, just as he was threatening before. Now with a pawn to boot, of course this would be a boon for black. So, since we kept the bishop pair, Dom decides to play the move bishop f4, still trying to keep it, of course. And now we see knight df6, and you can see how black's pieces are starting to work cohesively together. The two knights and the bishop are doing a great job of controlling the central squares, and white is sort of struggling to find a harmonious way to utilize the pieces and attack any weaknesses in the black's camp, with c7 really being the only weakness for the time being. So here Dom makes a decision which again is inaccurate, but does make a little bit of sense, in that he plays the move bishop to b3. And he's preparing to put a rook on the c-file or a queen on the c-file, either way, and start trying to target this c7 pawn. Just like we mentioned before, white needs to move with some time to do this, but unfortunately black has a very nice way of taking advantage of this last move. If you haven't, pause your video, see if you can find a nice positional move for black which will eliminate the two bishops for white. So in this position, Kalen plays the move knight to c5, and this is a very nice move, opening up the diagonal onto the f3 knight, creating space for his other knight to jump to the center if he wants, attacking the bishop, and utilizing the fact that this d4 pawn cannot take, because now that the bishop has moved, the d3 queen will be hanging, and obviously white doesn't want to give up the queen. So with this comes multiple threats. Obviously the fork, white can defend the pieces, but is not going to be able to save the two bishops or any of the positional pluses that they have. So at this point, white is not only down a pawn, but starting to fall apart a little positionally. Queen to c2 occurs. Kalen throws in the intermezzo move bishop to e4, which can often be a good idea in these sort of positions when your opponent's retreating. You can throw in a little attack in the middle to improve a little bit more. However, in this particular position, we see a transposition anyway. After queen to c3, knight takes b3, queen takes b3, bishop takes f3, and g takes f3. We get the same position we would have gotten from knight takes bishop, capturing and then capturing without the intermezzo of bishop to e4, but nonetheless we reach a point where now black is still up a pawn, just as we mentioned before, and white now still has some positional weaknesses in the doubled pawns, no positional plus on the two bishops. Only one bishop for knight is not so big of a threat to have to worry about. And black's only weakness in the camp is c7. So as long as black can find a way to consolidate this c7 square and keep the initiative going, then black really shouldn't have a lot of problems in this game. So we can see that through the opening, black has definitely won the first phase of the battle. However, there's still a lot left to go in this game, and even though it has been an interesting display of how to play the Nimzo so far, and a great job of that, that's not the reason why this is the game of the week, and we'll see just what madness ensues over the next few moves. So queen to d5 is Kalen's move, and this is a very strong centralizing move, placing the queen on arguably the most powerful square on the board, threatening the f3 pawn, and simply offering an exchange of queens. If white were to accept this and make the trade of queens, after knight takes d5, the knight holds the c7 square, the c7 pawn is no longer hanging, the knight also threatens to take on f4, moves like rook to c8 and c5 are coming and natural in the position, and black is going to look to mobilize this queenside pawn majority and try to use that in order to win the game. Very straightforward plan for black and very difficult for white to deal with. Now, objectively speaking, the computer sort of says this may be white's best course of action. Just trade off and go into this worse ending, but most of us are going to look at this and say, this does not look fun. This is not the sort of chess game that I want to play. And so I really like the decision that Dom makes here with the move queen to d1. Now, this keeps the queens on the board and basically is saying, hey, you know what, my position is worse, I am a little more passive, my queen's defending f3, black's queen is much more active, black is also up a pawn, but you've got to beat me in a game of chess still. There's still a lot of chess to play, and you've got to prove the win. And that's exactly what this queen d1 move does, and after this move, we'll see that the plan Kalen comes up with is not the most accurate one and starts leading to a little bit of trouble and some fun dynamic tactics over the board. Now, looking at this position again, like we mentioned before, black is very solid. Black should aim to mobilize their queenside and play c5 at some point. So, in my opinion, a move like rook a or maybe even rook f to c8, preparing for the c5 break, would make the most sense, or even just playing c5 right away. All three of these are very strong options in this position. This is sort of the straightforward, I've got an advantage, I'm not going to take any risks style of pushing to win this game for black, and it's a very good straightforward plan. However, Kalen goes for a much more aggressive plan and says, you know what, my queen is eyeing this kingside, the knight is coming to the kingside already, your bishop's a little bit awkward over here, your queen's a little bit locked out, I'm gonna go all in on a kingside attack, and we see the move g5 from black. And now we are starting to get into a much crazier position. Again, this is a very double-edged sort of move, and why is that? Well, we're moving this g-pawn in front of our king. Right now, white doesn't have a clear way of taking advantage of that, but you can see that already the knight is a little bit looser on f6 over here, and white does have the potential of sliding this king over, putting the rook on the g-file, and trying to use this half-open g-file to their own advantage. So this is a very double-edged move, a fun move, and now the game enters some very enjoyable territory. So after g4, Dom again perhaps makes not the most accurate decision. Bishop takes c7 is the most straightforward looking move, simply getting the pawn back in the position, though it is a little bit of a scary move to make because we know we're going to have to probably retreat the bishop after a move like one of the rooks coming to the c-file, and it seems like black is coming with time, the attack is building very fast. So Dom decides to play a different move and strike back in the center with e4, gaining an immediate tempo on the black queen and taking space back, keeping the game in very double-edged territory. After queen to d7 though, black is now defending the pawn, bishop takes c7 is no longer in the position, so even though the attack maybe doesn't look as scary on the king side, white does not get back the pawn and really does not have enough compensation at the moment for what is happening here. Bishop to g3 occurs, retreating the bishop to safety, and now black decides to continue with the plan with the move knight to h7. Again, perhaps not the most precise, but there's a very clear idea that black is striving for, clearing space to play f5 and start going after the white king. And oftentimes, it's better to play with a clear plan than it is to necessarily always play the most precise move if you don't know the reason behind it. And so, even though this might not be the most accurate way of going about things, this is a way that has a clear, straightforward method for black, and I like that black is following through with what he's already done by committing to the king side with g5. So queen to d2 comes from white. It's trying to get to the diagonal, keep some pressure over here on these pawns, make it harder for them to push. f5 from black, continuing with the plan. White plays the move e takes f5, e takes f5, and now bishop to e5, bringing the bishop to a very nice outpost. It's supported by the d4 pawn, and it's very hard to kick this bishop now. Now the black queen comes back to the d5 square, leaving the protection of c7, but again attacking f3 now that that's undefended, and going back to that nice central position that already it formerly had. White plays the move f4. This is both a securing move, securing the position of the bishop on e5, as well as an aggressive one, threatening to perhaps take on g5 and try to get back at that black king. Part of the defensive purpose of this is black all along, as we've been saying, at some point would also like to play c5, so now that f4 is here, this bishop being more solidified allows the potential for pawns to be traded without the bishop hanging. Now black plays a very interesting move, and this allows white to get a little bit back into the game. We can see how white is starting to threaten to undermine the safety surrounding the king, so here black tries to come up with a way, and this is a very creative move, a way to solidify on the king side. However, I don't know that it is the most aggressive or what is quite called for in the position, and we see king to f7. And this is a move that probably looks a little crazy at first. What is the king doing? Well, the point is the king is heading for this g6 square, trying to help out in the defense of g5 and not be stuck here on the back rank. It also frees up the flexibility of black's rooks. They can slide over to the g files, h files, things like that. So it's not a move without its merits. However, in this position, I think that this may not be the most accurate. Black has a lot of other options, a lot of other ways to continue with the attack. You could keep things closed with g4. You can think about moving the knight back to f6 and improving positions that way after. You can bring your other rook into the game. I think there are other more pressing matters for black, but again, now we can feel the game sort of flow into a new dynamic territory. Early on, we had a position where white was down a pawn and was trying to claw their way back with something, and now we have a very dynamic position with chances for both sides, and I would say that dynamically speaking, even though black is still up a pawn, dynamically this game is likely at an equal point, where chances certainly exist on both sides. So f3 is played from Dom, trying to close off the diagonal of the queen, free up a little bit of space for the rook and for the queen as well. We see c5 at last from black, finally getting off the c7 square, striking back at the center, and mobilizing the queenside majority. Queen to c2, aiming at the f5 square, and now the king comes to where it was aiming to from the start with king to g6. And again, black has to be very careful because even though white's structure is a little bit awkward here, it's doing a very good job of striking back at the black structure, and at any point white might even throw in a move like h4 and try to completely blow things up in front of both kings, and things can get even crazier. Rook a to d1 from Dom, lining up the rook with the queen, a nice looking move there, and Kalen plays the move c4, trying to close down the queen side. And here we see another position. Now, imagine yourself having the white pieces here. What should you do? Clearly, things are a little bit closed up on the king side at the moment. Our king is maybe a little awkward on g1, and black has a very clear queenside majority. If these pawns start marching down the board, then we are going to have a bad day, and black is going to be the one promoting and winning the game. So really the only counterplay for white is occurring on this king side right now, and here a move that really needs to happen is one we mentioned before, h4. This was Dom's chance to not only potentially get back into the game, but maybe even take over the initiative and be better for the first time the entire game. Everything is converging on this g5 square, lines are opening up, the rooks are ready to lift up and over, and it's going to be very difficult for black to avoid losing all of the protection around his king. and avoid running into enough tactics where white can at least be equal, if not potentially find a breakthrough on the king side over here. However, in the game, we see the move rook to f2 instead, lifting up the rook, a flexible move, keeping an eye on both sides over here, and getting ready to go to the g-file at some point perhaps. a5 from black. We already know black's best winning plan. Get those queenside pawns rolling. Once again, h4 makes a lot of sense in the position, but Dom takes a move to play queen c3, trying to secure this b4 square and stop the pawns from rolling up the board. A very sensible idea. However, black also is eyeing ideas of their own. b5 taking the space, and of course, a rook could always slide over to protect, though the bishop is covering that square. Maybe we lift and bring one over, or maybe we even end up pushing anyway in order to potentially put more pressure on a square like f3, which is what we see in a couple moves. So rook to g2, putting the rook in line with the king, but now b4 anyway. And after a takes b4, a takes b4, queen takes b4, well, the point is queen takes f3, and I don't even know how to evaluate this position. There is so much going on. The white rook is pinning the pawn to the black king. h4 is something that's in the air still. The bishop is nice and beautifully anchored on e5. The knight on h7 is not looking too great. However, black also has this passed c pawn, which could pose problems for white as it runs up the board. The queen is very active and scary looking around white's king, which has lost almost all of its pawn protection. The rook dominates the a file, ready to jump into the attack. So who is better here? Who has more threats? What is going to happen in this position? I think we have finally entered utter madness and a really just rich and crazy position to look at. I love what has happened over the board here. However, unfortunately, what may look like the most aggressive move for white is the move that actually loses the game. So here Dom plays queen to d6. Queen d6 check. This looks very natural, attacking the king and saying, what are you going to do? I'm getting ready to come after your king, right? This can't be a bad move. Unfortunately, this move actually loses on the spot. Now, there are three ways of getting out of the check. You could move the king, or we could block with the rook or with the knight. Moving the king is not going to do a lot of good for us, but either of the blocks will lead to a winning position. In the game, we see the move knight to f6, which is better for black. However, there was an even better move, and a move that may surprise you is rook to f6 is actually the winning move for black. And what's the point here? Well, the point is that the queen is now under attack by the rook, and not only that, but our queen is threatening to take on d1 with check. So, for white, there's no good way around both of these threats. Of course, if you take my rook with the queen, well, you just lose your queen then, and I'll happily take that back. Thank you very much. If you take the rook with the bishop, what does black play now? Queen takes d1, the intermezzo, capturing the rook with check, and now we'll be able to recapture the bishop on the next move and be up a full piece. Actually, it's even worse than that, because what can white do? Well, white has to play king to f2, and now, guess what? The other rook can come into the position, and these pawns over here create a nice wall on the fourth rank, so no matter where the king goes, the king can go to e3 or to g3, it doesn't matter. Queen to d3 is checkmate. So not only could we take back a piece and be up a full piece, but white is getting mated here. So rook to f6 would have been immediately winning for black. However, in the game, knight f6 is played, and we get to see a little bit more creativity here along the way. So rook to f1 from white, moving out of danger, striking back at the black queen. Queen goes to e3 with check, and even though it comes with tempo, king to h1 is really where the white king wants to go anyway, finally getting off of the g file, preparing to double, and trying to find some last counterplay on that king side. Rook a to d8 attacks the white queen, and here white misses one more chance to create a little bit of madness, a little more tactical shots. Dom plays the move queen to c6, getting out of the attack, but here the move queen to e7 is actually pretty dangerous as well, and the point here is that if black makes a move like, let's say, c3, trying to push the pawn and continuing on to promote, well, bishop f6 is very nasty because the king cannot retake that bishop, and of course if the rook does, bye-bye to your other rook. The queen is still threatening all sorts of checks, and we should be able to stop this c-pawn from promoting. So queen to e7 would be a nice way to keep the pressure in the position, but after queen to c6, now black is starting to solidify and take control. The king is starting to become a little more secure. We see the move queen to d3, trying to keep the pawn over here. Rook f to g1, doubling those rooks on the g-file, trying to break through, trying to get all of these pieces in on the attack. And g4, shutting down the door. At long last, this tension has been remaining between the f and the g pawn for so many moves now, and now finally g4, and one of the main points here is that white can't get away with h3, which would be nice, trying to chip away, because of course queen takes h3 just comes with check and loses the pawn, though maybe even this is okay as well, because after a move like queen takes h3, rook h2, and if the queen slides over, now the h-file's open for attack as well. So this could have been another idea for white to tinker with here in the position. After g4, we see the queen come back to e6, and this has a nice little idea to it. White is trying to go all in on putting pressure on this king, all in on the pressure against g4 and the diagonal. However, black is just a little bit too solid here. c3 is the next move from Kalen. Here comes the c-pawn marching down the board. White has to do something about this, and really white is starting to run out of firepower. So what can Dom do? And I'm going to give him credit for this move. Of course, unfortunately, it doesn't work, but really, what else can white do in this position? There's not a good way to stop the c-pawn from moving. Black is nice and solidified now. He can play moves like h5 to solidify g4. There's no great breakthrough for white unless we go this moment, and here comes rook takes g4. And unfortunately, this beautiful looking move does not quite work. But what is the point? What is the point behind rook takes g4? Well, there's a few different ways that black can react. He could take with the f-pawn, or he can move the king, and that's really it. We can't take with the knight because of the pin from the queen, and any king move is going to lead to some really dangerous threats. If we play king to h7, trying to deny it, well, after a move like queen to e7, the queen is coming into g7 and giving mate, so king to h7 is not going to work. If we play king to h5, well, now everything is breaking through. The world is falling apart after bishop takes f6, attacking the rook again. Even though our rook is on pre, we just have too many threats hanging in this position. If you, for example, take the rook, well, we can just take the pawn back. That's checkmate. Thank you very much. I'm happy there. If black tries to play a check with queen to f3, well, there's just not going to be enough happening here. After a move like rook takes g2, we can see that white is up a full piece in the position, and with a still raging attack, threats against f5, and I'm just not sure how black is going to survive. So moving the king is not going to work. The only move, of course, is to accept the sacrifice, f takes g4. Well, now that we've sacrificed one piece, all we can do is play for mate. We've got to find some way to break through, so we may as well go all in, and here comes rook takes g4 again. And the point, once more, the knight is pinned, cannot capture the rook, and where can the king go? Well, we already looked before. If the king goes to h7, white will win the game, crashing through queen e7, and after king h8, the queen coming to g7 delivers mate. However, unfortunately for Dom here, Kalen has one other out, one other square for the king, and that's king to h5, and now Unfortunately, as scary as it is, as many pieces are as close to this black king, white has no decisive way of breaking through. Dom tries to move bishop takes f6, trying to get rid of the knight's attack and see if he can't get the queen any closer. However, after the move, only one move actually that wins here, rook takes f6. White's attack is just too slow. Surprisingly, the rook is holding enough of the squares around that really all white can do is capture it back. And the other try here is rook to h4 check, which Dom plays. However, after king takes h4, queen takes f6. Look at that, a fork of the king and the queen. White's getting ready to win back all their material, and I count 3 pawns for white, where black only has 2. Well, what's the problem here? The problem is after the king moves away, if we are to take the rook, checkmate on f1, nowhere for the king to go, trapped by his own pawn. So unfortunately, after the move of the king, white has no way to recover the material with check because of the threat of mate on f1. h3 is tried in the game. Queen takes h3, king g1, queen e3, and at this point, all black has to do is get out of the checks, secure the material, and the game will be over. King h1 is played, and queen takes d4, defending the rook, asking to trade off, and there's just not enough left for white. White tries to give a few more checks, looking for that perpetual, but the king begins to head to safety, move by move, taking all of the rest of white's material along the way, running itself over to the queen side, and after queen to f1, queen to d3, queen f4, king b3, queen f6, white has ceased to give check for a move, and now black can take over and deliver a winning blow. In the game, queen d1, king g2, rook d2, king g3, queen e1, king g4, rook g2, lots of other techniques and ways to go at this point. King h5, queen h1, queen h4, and, well, black could consider the move rook h2, winning the queen. However, as Gary Kasparov once said, I am up enough material. We see the move queen takes h4, and after king takes h4, c2, black will promote and play queen h1 in the coming moves, and the game is over as white finally resigns. So a very fun game, lots of exciting tactics in here. I hope you've enjoyed checking this one out as much as I did. Some great opportunities happened on both sides, and this was just a very enjoyable one to watch. Hopefully you have enjoyed it as well. Make sure to send in your games, like your videos, and come on out Monday nights to see more action in Jacksonville's Chess for Charity. Thank you very much, and have a great week. If you enjoyed